All right. Well, Spring Office Hours, episode 4, the second one today. We have shuffled some things around. We had a little tight window this morning. So we had episode 3 this morning where we took a look at a lot of the news going on in the Spring world. And this afternoon, we're just going to take a look at some code and answer some questions. So should be fun.
Yeah, I don't know if you hung around, but we've had a pretty good day of just Tanzu TV. We went from our show to then Whitney, and then Nate did his great session with Jennifer Rain. I think I'm saying the last name right. But awesome day. There's only been a little bit of off the air time, so it's been fun.
Yeah, Nate is a huge fan of Ted Lasso, so I always end up referring to him as Nate the Great. So
that works.
Cool. So we have a little bit of an agenda today, but we also have some room to do some other things. So again, if you want to kind of get in touch with what's new, you can check out the video from this morning. That will be up on. Let me just go ahead and pull that up so everybody knows where to find that. And share my screen. So that'll be up on Spring Office Hours. If you go to the Tanzu Developer Center and go over to Tanzu TV and go to Spring Office Hours, that was episode 3. I even got some show notes in here already for the things that we talked about. But if you want to just kind of get caught up on the news, this is the episode for you. And then, we decided that since we're recording again in the afternoon, that's really a new episode. So what we're doing here is episode 4. Really, it's a lot more than that, but the first 10 were beta. So those were trial and error ones. So I think what we'll do is we'll talk about a question that we talked about this morning. We'll actually go into it, take a look at some code, and then we will answer any questions you have. So if you have questions, throw them up in the chat. We'll get to those. If we can't find any, DaShaun, you reminded me this morning of this amazing Twitter community we have. If you go to... Let's see. I think I can get to it from here. I used to be able to. Where is it?
Communities. It's up at the top there.
Did I miss it? Oh, there it is. Yeah, it is like hiding up there. So we have this great community. I'll link to this in the show notes today. Look at that. A little over 2,000 members. And there are a bunch of questions in here, and a lot of the community members are answering these questions, so that's great to see. But maybe we'll pop in here and see if we can find some questions to ask from here as well. So
I am trying to follow up and check out that community at least daily, or trying to anyways, just to see if there's any unanswered questions, and point people in the right direction. So yeah,
feel free. Yeah, I have also been running another community, which is the Facebook Spring Boot developers. We have 60,000 members on here. It's crazy. It's very hard to keep up with that. I am an admin on there. Maybe I'll rope you in to help me admin this, DaShaun. It is tough to admin because there's so many. Today there's only 4. Still, there's 30 posts already that I got to go through. But there are so many good questions on here as well. And, maybe we could go through here as well and see if we find any questions. So cool. 2 great communities. And again, we're always trying to think of ways that we can kind of collect these questions into one place. The show's getting better and better. We're evolving over time. We're kind of adding new stuff to the show as we go along. And that'll be one of those things. So, DaShaun, did you have a chance to look at the question that I gave you this morning?
And I had fun. So I'll tell you where my head's at, and I'll tell you it was, hey, we're going to do this thing. We're going to connect, and we're just going to build it. I went to start.spring.io, and I built out a project, and I was going to use Spring Boot 3, the latest M3.
Nice.
Awesome. Yeah. And I went and I said, oh, I'm going to just try all these new things and see how easy it is. And I got stuck, and that's
Yep.
okay.
Yeah.
But the approach that I was taking was I was going to create a function that when you called that function, it would make a call to that third-party service. So I found a public API that I could use and validate with.
Well,
And
hold on
yep,
a second. Do you want to back up? Maybe I can go through this question
yeah,
for people just joining us because maybe they weren't here this morning.
that's okay.
And then if you want to, you can go ahead and walk through your solution and your thought behind there, and then I'll go through mine.
That's okay.
So I got an email from somebody on my newsletter. I always ask, I think at the beginning of the newsletter sequence when you sign up, again, it's free. Once you sign up, just ask you, hey, if you ever like running into questions, please let me know and we'll see if we can answer them. This question was, yeah, I'm struggling with this certain project that I'm trying to create. And the project is I want to go get data from a third-party API. So that's API number one. And then I want to save that data into a database and then take that data, which is already saved in my database, and send it to another third-party API, API number two. Tried to find on Google how to create a project like this, but I couldn't find it. So he explains the flow, says, God bless you. Regards, Delvin in Indonesia. And so DaShaun and I talked about this morning, and really, our job as software engineers, programmers, developers, whatever you do in this world, is the ability of problem solving. And that is one of those, one of the traits, I guess, of problem solving is the ability to break down complex problems into a series of smaller problems. Because as Delvin said, you're
I'll be
not
right
really going
back.
to be able to search. No problem. You're not going to really be able to search for something like this and find an exact answer of how to solve this problem, right? Because this is a series of problems. So taking the approach of how do we break this down into smaller problems? One, there is a problem of how do I call a third-party API within a Spring Boot application? Two, how do I take what I've gotten from that third-party API and save the results into a database? And then three, how do I take what's in my database and push those results from the database to another API, so API number two. So that is the problem at hand. And I think what I'll do is I'll let DaShaun kind of, you could share your screen if you want. And we'll talk through the solution. And like I said, I like how you started explaining it. I just wanted to get that in there. But the idea of, well, these are the things I want to use. I'm going to start that spring.io. I wanted to use Spring Boot 3, and I ran into some problems, and we can talk about those. So let's go through it.
Let's see. Did I do this right? Yeah, I think this will work. Can you see that?
Yep.
So yeah, this is what I was doing. I was going to create that Spring Cloud function. So this is my start, I guess. And I was going to call this public API. So I found this public API that basically tells you the sunrise and sunset given a lat and long. Seemed easy enough. So I was going to call that and then get that response. And from there, I was going to throw that response into Rabbit. And be done, right? Hey, just spit it out to the console just to show that it works. But put that event on RabbitMQ. And then on the other side, I was going to create a listener. That was basically just kind of listening to this. Also, Spring Cloud function, right? I'll do that. Binder to RabbitMQ. So then, after this guy's writing to that queue, this guy would pick it up automatically. So I didn't have to know where they're at. Just have that single message playing. in RabbitMQ. And this, when one of those is sent to that queue, this is going to pick it up. And from there, I was going to make that call to whatever other third-party API. That make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where, this is where loose requirements can have multiple interpretations. So this was a very broad, how do I do this? And we both thought about it right away and said, all right, this is where we're going to go. And like you said this morning, we did have two different approaches, which is great. Because if we ended up with the same thing, that wouldn't have made much of an office hours episode. So cool. I like it.
So yeah, I didn't get very far. I got a little bit stuck on my implementation details, but this is something that I'm going to share tomorrow or on Wednesday during our code session.
Cool. Looking forward to it.
Yes.
All right, let me pull this over here. So I have a repo here if you want. Again, I had a little bit more time. I started working on this last night. Yesterday during nap time. Nap time is my free time around here to work on stuff. So we are running out of nap times with the 4-year-old. She doesn't want to nap anymore, which is okay. She's kind of independent, but the almost 2-year-old still naps. So that's my time to get work done. So I started this yesterday and I'm just going to run through the code. Like I said, we may build this out in a video or a code session where we can, talk through each line of code. But I just want to walk through kind of the solution that I have. So I started a single multi-project in Maven because I wanted to be able to push this to one repo so that everybody can just kind of grab the code. So this to-do service really has no code in it. This is just the parent. And then there are two projects in here. The first one is to-dos. So my thinking was there might be one to-dos service, and then it may push to different microservices, like a personal to-do and a work to-do, whatever. It's just a contrived example, but the to-dos is the main service. So this is the first problem that we have to solve for is we need to call a third-party API. The second one is we need to save those results to a database. So I took the liberty of grabbing JSON placeholder, which is this public API you can get a bunch of data from. I went with to-dos because it's easy. It just has an ID, a user ID, a title, and a completed. Didn't want to spend a lot of time working on the model. If we look at my POM, I am using the new off-the-shelf Spring Boot 2.7.0. We're using Java 17 because why not? You should be. And then we just have Spring Boot starter data JPA. Just realized that my lights are not on. Probably a little bit dark here.
You look beautiful.
Bring some light into this room.
Oh, look at that. Oh, wow.
So we have Spring Boot starter data JPA because we're going to model a to-do entity, and JPA is going to give us that ability to kind of quickly save stuff off, persist to a database. We're using Spring Boot starter web, and I have an H2 database. We're going to just use the in-memory database. So the first part of this was, hey, if we're using a to-do, we got to model a to-do, right? So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a representation of a to-do. Just contains those same fields that we have in the JSON placeholder API. So ID, user ID, title, completed. From that, I can create a repository. So this is an interface. If it's just an interface by itself, it's nothing special. But as soon as we extend this CRUD repository, it will get picked up. So this is from Spring Data, and this gives us all the CRUD functionality out of the box. So we don't have to write any of these things, which is nice. Lets us get up and off the ground quickly. So now with the model and the repository, I have what I need to persist new things into the database, right? So now my next step is, let me call the REST API, that JSON placeholders. So again, this JSON placeholders is just this URL. If you hit it, It's going to give you 200 of these to-dos, right? So I want to call this and I want to get all of those. So where and how do I do that? I'm doing this in the command line, the main application class using a command line runner. So Spring has two interfaces that you can use, the command line runner, the application runner. These basically start up after the application context has been created, which is important because we're going to use some beans from the application context and before the application starts. So this is a good place to do some initialization. I keep, I was trying to think about this the other day. I haven't thought about a lot of places where I use this in a production app, but in a demo app where I want to just initialize some data, this is where I would do this.
Yep.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
No,
so far, so good.
In production, I've done validation there.
Okay.
Like I want to check things. I want to check some, hey, this is configured right, or I validate I'm in this environment, so I have these expectations, ports are open, etc., certificates available.
Right. So any kind of bootstrapping, initialization, validation. Cool. So in the command line runner, I get two things: the JSON placeholder service that I've created over here, and a to-do repository. So the service has a single method in here that is get to-dos from JSON placeholder. What I'm using here is the REST template. So this REST template is getting auto-wired in for me. Back in my main application class, I just create a new bean for that because I'm using it in multiple places. It's the same configuration everywhere, so I'm just creating one bean so we don't have to keep recreating it. And I think, DaShaun, I was going to ask you about this. We've been involved in some discussions. I don't want to get too far into those, but I do want to bring this up in a further episode of Office Hours. So let's think about this and maybe take some questions if anyone has them. But I think there's a lot of confusion around REST template, when you should use it, when you shouldn't. It seems like people think it's evil and you should never touch it, and like, the world's on fire. And I think from my perspective, and I want to ask some people who know a little bit more about this, including yourself. For me, if you're using Spring MVC still, there is no reason to move away from REST template until there is a reason to move away from REST template. If you want to if you need to worry about asynchronous calls, then yes, let's bring in Webflux. Let's use the web client. Let's deal with it. But I see a lot of people bringing in the Webflux client, Webflux starter, bringing in the web client, and then writing blocking IO, which to me is like, why are you bringing in this package to do that?
Yep. That's exactly the path. I'm still in that mindset. I'm still trying to switch from this reactive programming model to this reactive programming model.
Right.
So yeah, that's where I got stuck. And some days it feels like it clicks and I get it and I can go real fast, but I'm still learning.
Yep. And I think some of it comes with, in the docs for REST template, it says that, it encourages people to use the web client, which is true. Again, you should get into that mindset of reactive programming if you can, because one of the things that it solves is this blocking IO stuff that we're doing right here, right? But to pull that package in and then use the web client to just block is kind of counterintuitive. But I don't know all, and like I said, I want to have this discussion further on. I just thought I'd bring that up when, and from what I've heard from at least a couple of people on the Spring team, in the docs, it says that there is no new work being done on the REST template. It doesn't mean that like we want this to go away tomorrow. Like, it's feature complete. Like, it does what it needs to do. At some point, I don't know, it may go away, it may not. But all we're saying in the docs is if you can use web client and you can get away from this blocking paradigm, do so. But I'm in Spring MVC. I'm running a blocking operation here. there's no point for me to use anything other than REST template. REST template works fine in this situation.
Yep. And if I were trying to take something to production, that's my default. I've got all that experience, and those things are tools that I already have. So it would have been much easier. But I'm in this mode of learning, and I want to learn this new paradigm. So
Yeah. And even, you say you take those services to production and you have a ton of REST template calls around there, and somebody on your team says, hey, performance isn't that great. We have to spin up all these instances. And it's like, well, we do have this one thing that we're doing that is taking a lot of, threads away from other things that can be happening. So that's one place to look. So cool. All right. So with all that, I'm using REST template. I'm using REST template's exchange method here to basically call an endpoint. The method is get. I don't have a request entity. I'm not adding anything to the headers or anything. So this can be null. If you look in here, it says, So request entity can be null if you look in there somewhere. Now, one of the things is, so you have to supply the response type. And this always catches me. When you're using something like a list, I am using a list of to-dos here as the response type. If you just use like list.class as the response type, you end up getting, I can't remember what the default is now. I think like a hash map or a linked hash map or something. So you have to use this parameterized type reference. And so that is the return type, and that just says, hey, we are returning not just a list, we're returning a list of to-dos. So when we call out to this, we're going to get the body, which is going to give us all those 200 to-dos. And again, REST template, we're working with Jackson underneath the hood. It's going to help map all of this for us. So back in my main application class, I'm getting all those to-dos from that service. And then I'm just using the repository, the CRUD repositories method to go ahead and save all those to-dos to a database. So before we get to the other side of this is solving basically 1 and 2, which is call third-party API, save the results to a database. So I'm going to start up this first application. And if you didn't know, in IntelliJ, there's a services view. So if you go to view, tool windows, services, if you're running more than one service in kind of one window here, this is a nice place to kind of manage that stuff instead of having to like run one and then run the other one. So my to-dos application is started up. Oh, and I guess there is some logging there. So let me show you this. I do have the H2 console enabled. I set a data source. I am showing some JPA so we can see all these inserts happened. And if we do that, now we can go over to localhost 8080 and go to H2 console, log into our database here, click on to do, and there they are. So we have 200 to-dos in the database. So that's step 1. Now that they're in here, I need a way to push these to a third-party API. So I thought I would just create a controller method, or a couple controller methods here, so that I have an API here so that if you wanted to hit this and basically trigger sending of one or all of them, we could do so. So we have a REST controller. It has a request mapping of /APIs/to-dos. So this would be on localhost 8080/API/to-dos. We are getting our to-do repository and a new service in here called to-do service, which we'll look at. And we have a mapping defined off. We just want to list them out, but these are the 2 mappings I'm looking at. So if I want to send one particular to-do to this third-party service, I'm going to call transfer 1 and then the ID. We'll get the ID out of the path variable. We'll go ahead and find that in the repository. If it's there, we'll go ahead and call our service.transfer1. And again, transfer 1 is just using REST template. We have a service URL that we have externalized into configuration here in application.properties. So when we want to transfer 1, we're using the REST templates post for entity. This allows us to call, say, a URL. this second argument is going to be the request body, like what do we want to send? The third argument here is what are we getting back? And so in this case, I just want to return a Boolean saying that it was received or not. So this is the next service that we have to create, right? We need, if there was like if there was some mock service out there that I could use, I would just use that. But I decided to create a second Spring Boot app to do this. And to start a second Spring Boot app, I'd have to change the port because we can't both start up on 8080. So let's take a look at the second app. The second app is very simple. It's just called Personal To-Dos. From a Palm's perspective, again, 2.7 and Java 17. All we have in here is Spring Boot Starter Web because all we're grabbing is we're going to use a REST controller here. From a resources standpoint, again, we're changing the port because we want it to start up on a different port. So I'm setting that to 8081. I have a model of a to-do, but in this case, we're not using Spring Data JPA, just a normal application here. So I can use a record. So I have a record for to-do. And then in my controller, again, this is on /API/to-do. I have a post mapping for receive one and a post mapping for receive all. And all that does is take in the request body and log that out that it was done. So if we go to our services, we only have one application started. We can go ahead and run the second one here. So now again, from a to-dos application perspective, we have some, we have a URL that we can hit, right? So we can go to /API/to-dos/ I think transfer 1, and let's just say 2. And if we look in our logs here, so in the to-do application, we are sending to-do number 2. To-do was sent to personal to-do service. So if we go over here, personal to-do applications, that personal to-do controller received one to-do, which has an ID of 2. So that was, the request was received on the to-dos application, and we sent it over to the second one that we built. And then we can do the same for transfer all. Let's say we wanted to send them all. And you can see that personal to-do controller received a to-do of 200 to-dos. So we got those 200 right in here. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Just 2 separate applications, one to consume an API, save it to a database, and the controller methods to facilitate or initiate a transfer to the second service that we created. And everything's here in a single repo, and that's up on my GitHub.
Nailed it. Nice work. I always forget about doing the nested projects, and that definitely would have been a good idea in this case. Well done. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's really, I don't care, like from a perspective of running 2 services on my machine, but when you want to package something up and share it to somebody and say, hey, just download this and run them all, it makes it easier. Yeah.
Yeah, for this case, definitely. Definitely.
Cool.
I had fun doing that.
Yeah, me too.
I had fun, but I also had fun watching and listening Whitney's show and watching and listening to Nate's show. So yeah,
yeah, for sure.
That was fun. And I'll tell you the other thing that I did. I went and reopened my Reactive Spring book from our friend Josh Long because I just need more reps on that. So I'll be digging into that between now and then.
No, I'm with you. I mean, I have done some work in that space, but not nearly enough. So yeah, I'm in the same place.
Not automatic yet. We gotta practice the hard things, do the hard things until they're easy.
Yep, for sure. All right. So again, Delvin, thanks for that question. If you guys are watching this or the replay and you're not sure, you don't want to ask questions live, we get it. I've been there. Send us, you can find us on Twitter. Our handles are here in those little blue boxes. You can always email us. If you go over to, you guys You should be resourceful enough to find my email address.
Yes.
It's not that
But I'll
hard.
say this, the question, from Delvin was not specific, it was loose, and that's okay. This exercise, I hope, is valuable. Coming at a similar, loosely formatted set of requirements and getting different perspectives on how to approach it. I'm
Yeah.
hoping that that's valuable. I know it's valuable for me when I have those types of situations, and I can get more than one perspective. Because there's probably more details. There's a different context that
Right.
we haven't discussed, and now Delvin's got a couple of options to consider.
Yep. Cool. Um,
Sweet Killer 9
right.
is here, and Sweet Killer 9 has been a really awesome member of our community, always showing up for the shows. Great questions, great insights. So thank you for showing up.
Thank you.
I see a question here: how to design persistible policy? I would love to get more details. I'm wondering what might you mean by persistible policy? Like, hey, is it that you're trying to put validation around whatever you're trying to persist? Maybe you want to have some validation rules. That would be one thing. That's where my head's going. But I'm not sure if I've got a concept of a persistence policy as a blanket object or a blanket artifact. So I would love to hear more information about what you're thinking. Good question. But yeah, I'll ramble on that for just a minute. Sometimes let's just talk about security. You can validate the data type. We can do that pretty easily using our configuration properties. We can say, hey, this is a type of this. It should be a type of this object. But sometimes you need a little bit more fine-grained validation where, hey, I don't want this to be a negative number or a positive number, etc. And ranges, you can put those different, look at there, valid validation rules for business objects. Yes. What are your thoughts like saving flags like valid, etc.? Yeah. So we have the validation. Let me see if I can pull that up quickly. Where, I can say on each element, I can actually have it on each member of an object. In the case of JPA, for example, where I can pass in, I can have its validation annotations. And you get some of those from just regular Spring JPA, right? Or Spring Data JPA is where I'd pull them from. But some of them are from Hibernate, and there's different use cases for each. Give me a second.
Yeah, and I think some people, because it does say bean validation with Hibernate validator, some people think that you need to have like Hibernate around, and this can be done in the context of just Spring MVC without even having to worry about the database. So,
Thank you.
but you do need to pull this validation package in. It used to be part of Spring Web. It's a separate dependency now. So if you're going to do that type of validation, that bean validation, you want to pull these two dependencies in.
So keep going. Dolphin, I hope I'm saying the name right. Keep going on that. What are you trying to accomplish? Tell us where your head's at. This is just one approach. We do.
Yeah, I'm just I was gonna bring this up just in case we wanted to look at it, but I'm not sure. Actually, oh, there's a follow-up. So I usually have that doubt if you should store valid flag in some aggregate to pull this on some view.
Got it. So that's another way of doing things. Like, hey, maybe you're getting data from another non filtered source, some other source that has a different way in, so you don't have that ability to validate on insert or other.
Gotcha.
So I will put this guide around validating form input. That's one that's I've used before. But then, yeah, this idea of do I need to store? I'm hoping that any type of data source or data store, I'm hoping that if it's going to be consumed, I want to make sure that it's validated before I consume it. That is definitely an idea. And if I've got some other stream of data coming in, I might apply some filter to that data before I store it in my source of data to consume. That might be one approach. But these are good questions. I can say that I've never stored a valid flag or other. Yeah, I've never stored, or I can't think of a time where I've done that. I have had where a member profile was missing information, so it was not completed yet. Yeah, but then my object, what I was returning, wasn't complete, so I had a null exception, and then that exception was going to be used to let the user know that they had data to fill in still. But I don't think that I've ever stored hey, yes, this entity or this object is valid. I don't think I've ever stored that flag. So I'm trying to think. Dan, have you ever done anything like that?
No, not really. We may have, so we've done logging in the past where we've logged that type of information so especially on like user registration type stuff, if we're starting to get enough complaints that like, hey, users can't register, well, it's probably like not passing validation somewhere. Let's log that information so we can start to figure out where people are having issues. I'm just trying to understand this question a little bit more. So I was putting together like a basic validation demo here as we were talking, but it doesn't seem like that is the issue. So I'm just going to keep.
Yeah, I mean, he's doing a good job, or they are doing a good job of following up. I'll let you go. Yeah. So what kind of arguments would you use to explain to a team that we should not persist flags like valid in a database? I'm of the mindset that if it is in the database and all of its elements are filled in, it's valid.
Yep.
But what about the case where not every element is required? How do you tell if it's valid or not? And I think I'm holding that in my object definition instead of in the database.
Yeah.
That seems like one of those rules that could change. I wouldn't want to have to reevaluate. What about the case where I want to add? I'm looking at your example right there. Go ahead and throw that example back up.
All right, I was gonna.
What about the case where I want to add? What if I had this employee table and I had a column on there that said valid, but then later I decide I want to add another column called address? Is it valid or not? If that address is empty, is it valid or not? I would have to go and reevaluate, and then I'd have an entirely different set of problems because I could add that column without adding the address. Is it valid or not? That's just one case. But
and like you said, valid is a fluid situation. It's not always going to be the same thing. So
yeah,
your validation should happen as those things are getting inserted. So
yep. And I'm assuming that there's some source of data that hasn't been validated. Think like a tax document. Oh, your social security is not filled in right, or this column is missing, or whatever. He's getting some source of data, and maybe there's not a user. How do you identify like, hey, we've captured this data. It's not valid because, and I think I've done one approach is to say, hey, here's my source of not valid data, stuff that's coming in, that input source. And if it's valid, as I loop through that data, as I'm reading that data, if I loop through there, if it's valid, then it goes to a different table, a different set of data. So I can clearly identify what's valid and what's not.
Yeah, and so as we're accepting these employees in our service, that's when we're doing the validation. So we're saying at valid, If it doesn't pass our validation checks, then we're not going to persist it into a database. And those validation checks are held on the entity here. And as you said, these are fluid. These can change later. We could come in here and say that we have the email address that we're capturing now. And guess what? That better be an email or it's not valid. So
now
that's done as we're kind of persisting data.
the next question is, so what if you want to query that employee and not every element has that email populated yet? Some of them do, some of them don't. How would you go and pull out just the valid ones?
So what you're doing there is then creating a custom query on the database, right? So if you're saying, again, I don't know what your idea of valid is. If you're saying all employees without an email address are no longer valid employees until we get that stuff in there, just give me a list of all the employees that do have an email address. So then whatever persistent storage engine you're using, whatever, if you're writing SQL yourself, if you're using JPA, there's a way to now to filter on that and say, just give me all the employees that have an email address populated.
Yep, I have another approach. And I'm trying to think of the name. Is it I have a table. I have that table that we just looked at. Pull up your employee table. And I want to get all of those, I think it starts with a P, projections. That's what I was looking for. My valid object has an ID, first name, last name, date of birth, and email. That thing that I'm querying, that table could have 20 other rows or 20 other columns. And I can use this projection to say, I only want the set of data that has these columns. And that projection, I believe, can also have validation on it. So all I'm doing is asking for that projection instead of asking for that employee object and doing validation on the response. So that is the projection. That's just a Spring data, right?
Yeah. So when you are in Spring Data, when you want to say like, okay, give me all of the employees where first name is like DA, so that would get Dan and DaShaun, and email is like DA, that would get Dan and DaShaun, right? So if you're just saying like where first name is this and last name is that, you can, in Spring Data, you can write like a query right inside your interface. Spring Data will create that query for you, and now you have something that you can query on. It's when you get into those situations where you have all these fields and you're like, well, this particular client wants to ask for first name and email. This one wants to ask for first name and last name. When you have these like multiple filters and you're asking and like whatever you're doing there, projections are great because you can accept like dynamic arguments and say, hey, give me a projection where first name is like this and email is exactly this. And that, it's like dynamic querying. So it makes that situation a lot easier.
Good stuff. I appreciate these questions, and I hope that that's moving you forward, getting you unstuck.
Just digging through some questions here to see if I can find any.
Excellent. We appreciate that feedback. This is it. This is office hours. We don't want you to get stuck. My family says if you get up from the dinner table and you're still hungry, that's your fault. Right? We made dinner. Like that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to bring you those answers. You're here and you still got questions. You didn't ask them.
I like that. I can appreciate that because we just made lunch a little bit ago and my one daughter didn't eat much. And then literally 5 minutes later, she goes, I'm hungry. I'm like, well, we just had lunch. You should have ate.
Yep. Yep. Bring them.
All right, let me see if I can find any other questions here.
So while you're doing that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this Spring Cloud Functions, some of the work that I've just been looking into. I have spent a little bit of time, that whole idea of, hey, I've got a thing that's, it's going to run 40 times a day. But maybe it's super important. Maybe it's order fulfillment or something 40 times a day. I don't necessarily need a container app that's going to stand up 24/7. The cost of that, doesn't map out, right? So I'm looking at this purely from a cost of resources, cost of ownership approach, where there are some cases of applications that might perform better, or not necessarily perform better, but would be much more cost effective if I was only paying for them the number of times that they were running. And let's just say that order details or that order form. I'm going to order a book, and I don't sell millions of books a day, so it's okay if it's not running. That time for it to start up is okay. That it consumes a different amount of memory and it has a different footprint is okay. It changes the way that I operate. It changes the model that I have in my head of what's running in production. But this idea of it's that one thing that's only going to get called a couple of times a day. Therefore, it's only going to cost me pennies per day. That's where my head's at. And I'm looking at it in that perspective, but also in that framing of Knative serving, where I can have things scaled to zero, even if it's an app, not necessarily a function. I can have these Spring Boot apps that are scaled to zero locally, and only when I call them will they stand up and accept that call with, from Knative serving those events to those different workloads that I'm running. So on my local environment, it's exciting. It's exciting that I have these options of having my to-do service scaled to zero. But then when it's time to hop on a show and walk through it, we can demo it and we can show it exactly as we expected, and it pops up and it starts running. So this is where my mind's at, and I'm looking at those differences between startup times for a Spring Boot app running on Knative serving, being delivered via Knative serving, and something that's implemented as a functional cloud service, functional service with Spring Cloud Functions. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's probably why I defaulted to the approach that I took.
I like it. We should come up with, I mean, who knows when we would do this, but a similar thing, like a particular project that has a little bit more stricter requirements, and have me and you build something out, and maybe even have some of our colleagues join in the fun and just see what everybody ends up with, like a show and tell.
Dolphin's got some more. He says, okay, your thoughts about complex queries instead of non-materialized views. Complex queries instead of non-materialized views.
So I've got to be honest, I've never heard of the term non-materialized views, although I am not a database guy, so that's probably why.
When I think of materialized views, like I've got my employee table and maybe my person table and address table, I can make a materialized view that combines them, and I can have the database combine and generate those, what ends up being queried just like a table, but it's this materialized view. It's something that I can't write to as a table, but I can read from it. Like,
okay, so database view. So I know what that is. I don't, like I said, I've never heard of the term non-materialized. So, but I do get that.
And this there are sometimes I like I feel comfortable going fast. So if I'm having to do complex queries in order to get the output or the response that I need, sometimes it makes me think, is there a way that I can reformat this data? And I've absolutely done that. Taken data from a source that would need complex queries or materialized views to be effective, and convert that. Do like a pre-compute process where, hey, if something's changing over here in this relational, more complex database, but I have this other report or view or response or whatever that I need, I will absolutely take and just automatically transform that using something like CDC or like a prefetched cache that says, hey, when things change over here, go ahead and update these values over here that I would have needed to do a complex query. I know it's going to take some time. I would rather have that result automatically populated. Even if there's millions of those results and I'm only going to access 100 of them a day, it doesn't cost me that much. I want my users to be happy about the response that they get, and it's worth it. Much better experience than having a long-running query, a complex query that might not have validated data on the other end. If I can validate that, I could do that on that transform to that prefetched cache or whichever model you want to use.
Cool. I like it. I don't have anything to add to that. Like I said, not a database guy. So,
Dan, do you have some best practices how to design microservice and how micro it should be to be optimized for Spring best performance?
wow, we could probably write a chapter in a book on this. So my first thought is, you've already decided that this is going to be a microservice. Fine. I always start there though, because at least at the last, people tend to gravitate towards microservices because this is what everybody says today. Like, microservices are a big buzzword right now. There are other distributed types of architecture, so we have to go through kind of a exploratory phase of like, do we really want to move to a microservice? I guess we'll leave that conversation for a different day. If you decided that yes, we want to move to microservices, the question then is, how big should they be? And unfortunately, when it comes to architecture, the answer you're going to get to a lot of things is it depends.
Yeah.
So it really is, there is no one silver bullet for all. The microservice should be as big as it needs to be.
And
only that big. And it's really the responsibility of that service, whatever that service is responsible for. That is exactly what it needs to be responsible for. There, in a microservice world, there's a database backing that service. So if you're working in, say, the e-commerce world and you have a products microservice, that products microservice should deal with products and not with orders or order items. It should delegate that responsibility to other microservices. And so that's really the approach you need to take. Don't ever think of like, this microservice has gotten too big or too small. The word microservice doesn't mean it needs to be very, very small. It needs to be as big as it needs to be to perform its function.
Yeah, another thing that I'll say about that is I have this concept. I have not read all the books. I'm not an expert in domain-driven design, but I've got this concept of a bounded context. On the screen a minute ago, we had this employee service. The things that are associated to an employee, you can imagine the employee-related data sitting in an employee data store of some type. And the idea is I want to have the things that are related to the employee existing in its own data store, and letting that be part of that context, that framing of, I don't want to add order processing into that microservice. The things that are in the employee service should be limited to things associated with employees. That's one thing that I'm thinking about when I do that. Also, sometimes those microservices aren't persisting data. There's no database. They're communicating. They're a part of the chain. Maybe it's an event-driven architecture. where it's message in, message out. What are you doing? And I'll go back to one of the things we said earlier. It should only be as big as it needs to be. Hopefully that helped. He says, yeah, hey, these are great answers. But yeah, let's keep going. Let's have this conversation. What's your ideal structure for microservice? What's your desired microservice that is state of the art, I assume, from your point of view? Structure, test, design, etc. Well, it starts with start.spring.io. And it follows that. And the reason I say that is not just like, hey, it's spring, because it should be looking forward. It should have some best practices built in. It should have some configuration defaults, all those things that you get with the Spring framework and with Spring Boot. Not only that, you've kind of helped yourself with that maintenance path. If you started a service with Spring Boot 2.6 and it's made it to production, today that path to 2.7 is an easy path. You know that if you change your version number on that parent POM from 2.6 to 2.7, you know that everything else that's included is going to be, it's going to work together. And because you're coming to office hours and you're reading release notes, you have help along the way. Having that path forward is the reason it would start with start.spring.io. And beyond that, I had this.
So
go ahead.
I will say this. I don't have a ton of original thoughts on anything. Like, I learn from people that have done this before me. And so 2 books that I would really, really recommend when it comes to architecture, microservices, that kind of stuff. First one is Fundamentals of Software Architecture from Mark Richards and Neil Ford. You can get that on O'Reilly. And this is kind of the overview of, how do I choose the right architecture? What are the different architectures out there? How can I, because again, we hear the term microservices, and there are different architectural decisions that you can make in the distributed world. Just because you want your application to be distributed doesn't mean it needs to be a microservice. A microservice is a bounded context, and it is talking to a database. Maybe you want to have a bunch of different services that talk to the same database. That is a different architectural decision. So this is a good place to start. I also, as you started talking about bounded context, I had to grab this book, which is Building Microservices, the 2nd edition from Sam Newman. Also a great book. And he said, right at the beginning of this book, microservices are independently releasable services, which are important, that are modeled around a business domain. And that's what DaShaun was talking about. The service encapsulates functionality and makes it accessible to other services via networks. You construct more complex systems from these building blocks. So again, it's all modeled around that domain. And that, in a microservice world, talks to a database, and you build these larger systems from that. So 2 really good books. I've probably read this book 2.5, 3 times now, and it's not that old. There's just so many good things to pick up from it. So lots of great stuff out there from some really smart people. Reading is probably my favorite thing to do, just because these people have, like Mark Richards and Neil Ford, have been doing this for 30 years, and they're very good at it. So learn from those who have come before you.
Those patterns and those approaches too. I've had several of these conversations the past couple of weeks where the idea, it's not up to the developer alone. Where are you deploying things? What's supported in your organization? In my head, I've got this concept of operations, this platform team that has a relationship and a contract with the developers to take things to production and to make sure things are working and they can scale and they can be observed, and all of those other abilities that you want from your applications. And when you're looking at the patterns, those best practices, it's going to change from org to org, and each org may support one or more patterns that you can take to production. But it's a conversation. We could say that, hey, this pattern is great. It's excellent. It solves our problem because of these 10 things. It requires a messaging bus. But if your organization doesn't have any concept of a messaging bus and nobody else can support a messaging bus, maybe that's not the best architecture.
Yeah, and as you said, it really does kind of depend on your organization. If you have siloed teams, so I have an engineering team, I have a database team, I have a DevOps team. It's going to be really hard to plug in microservices or some type of distributed architecture into that because the teams just aren't set up to build and maintain their own services, right? But if you have a team where, there's a couple engineers, a product manager, a database administrator, DevOps person, now as a team, we could focus on this one service and get it. We can design it, build it, test it, push it to production. So it really does, a lot of times it really is like how your organization is set up.
So some of the things we've talked about here on the show, I've got some defaults that are from practice, right? They're things that I see work for that 80% use case where I want to have persistence, and that persistence can depend on what the use case is. I also want to have caching. I want security to be baked in from the beginning, and that security conversation should happen up front. The observability, I believe that as a developer, an author of a microservice, nobody knows better how to monitor that and how to observe that than you do. So before you go to production, I think that you should be including some constraints, well, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for. Your watermark. Hey, if it reaches this point, scale it up. If it reaches this point, scale it down. Don't alert me unless these things happen. What are those triggers? What are those alerts that you want to be made aware of? Did I say documentation? I like microservices that document themselves. We talked last week about Spring REST docs and what you can do there, all the amazing things, the built-in client and the self documenting. All of your tests pass, your documents are reflecting what's actually in the code. What are some other things? I think I covered, like there's these examples that I want built in, and that covers the testing. That Spring REST docs example, I guess my pattern covers that testing as well. I threw up the 12factor.net as it's over a decade old, but it still holds true. I'm a big fan of the 15-factor set as well. But yeah, you should have these things baked in. And that's where my mind's at. Like those are some of the defaults, and bring them. You brought this question, like, what's the worst design decision that you made? And I have one that's near and dear to me, where we tried to overdo it. We had too many services. Like we had employee and employee roles as different services with different databases, and not only was it difficult to maintain, it created bloat, and it was it looked nice. It looked nice on paper, and it kind of followed all those rules. But yeah, it was difficult once it got to production. You needed to have even more formalized observability around your traces and your distributed tracing, but then your spans were much longer than they should have been. So yeah, that's one of those mistakes that I made early, was trying to make my microservices too granular, and it cost us quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you, and I think a project I was put on was like, hey, here's kind of the template that we've used. Stick to it, and this is how you should build it out. So as you said, it looked pretty on paper. All my graphs look good. Here's my architectural design document. Here's how we're going to build it. Everything's going to be great. And there were just too many services. And in the end, to get a simple list of things, we had to call through a gateway and through so many services to construct this one object. And queries were taking too long. And we're like, why is this happening? And as I was able to step back and look at it, I go, these 3 services over here should be one. There's no reason these services needed to be split out into 3 services. So always question that. If somebody tells you this is how we do it, ask questions. Don't just accept it as the norm. It may look good on paper, but as you start getting into actually building something and it doesn't work, don't be afraid to raise your hand and say, I don't think this is right. Like we could change this and probably simplify a lot of things.
You brought that up, that gateway to aggregate services, man,
Yeah.
that was, yeah, I've been there. But I alluded to that earlier, this idea of, hey, I have this thing that's going to call these 3 different services to aggregate some list. One of my favorite things is like, hey, I'm going to turn that around. I know that that's going to get called, and I know I have these 3 services. When they change, regenerate those reports, regenerate those
Yep.
aggregations in a different service or a different layer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes caching can fix that. If there's not a ton of data and this is something that doesn't change often, you can cache a lot of those objects at the gateway level or the aggregate level and do that. So I just wanted to throw this up there as we were talking. What we were talking about was kind of Conway's law. Organizations which design systems are constrained to designs which are copies of the communication structure of these organizations. And that's what we were talking about. If you have teams that are very siloed, like I have a database team and an engine, a back-end team and a front-end team and a DevOps team, then those are the applications that you're going to build. If you're going to build up teams like, hey, we're working on the e-commerce products team, right? Like we're in charge of products, then we could build these microservices that focus on the features of like products. So yeah, that has not changed over the long tenure of software design and will probably never change. So
not everything has to be a relational database. And
true.
Even if it is a relational database, not everything has to be normalized or third normal form. It's okay to have denormalized data, especially in the case of distributed systems. Yeah, it's okay. Don't be afraid to denormalize your data. So this is fun. Like this is hopefully valuable. Hopefully you're unstuck. Hopefully you have at least an idea of what to do next. Maybe it's not ready for production, but maybe you've got an idea on what to do next. That's all I could ask for. I really appreciate you bringing your questions. It is past 3:00. This has been fun. These are the kinds of sessions that I like. Dan, I really appreciate your insights. Sweet Killer 9, thank you so much for joining. Dolphin, thank you for bringing your questions. And thank you for sharing and expanding. Don't just bring one question like we're here. We still have the size of audience where we can actually have a conversation like that. And I appreciate it. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. All right. Well, with that, again, if you have questions, you know where we are. Check us out on the Tanzu Developer Center under Spring Office Hours. You can always come to these shows live and ask your questions. If you're watching a replay of this show and you have a question on something we talked about, or you'd like to get a question in, but you can't join us live, you could find us on Twitter here at, yep. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us over on the Tanzu Developer Center. You could find me over at danvega.dev.
DaShaun.com.
There you go, DaShaun.com. So yeah, many ways to find us. Get your questions in. I'm keeping a list of questions that I see out there in the wild or that get emailed to me. So as we get those in, we'll answer them. So with that, where are we in next? We'll see on Code on Thursday. Is that what we're saying?
code is on Wednesday, right? Tomorrow's Tanzu
Wednesday, so-
Tuesday. On Wednesday, I am going to cross my fingers, see if I can maybe get another office hours and go over the release notes for the two things that are being released on Wednesday, the Spring Authorization Server and the new release of Spring Cloud. And in combination with that and a separate show, our code show is where we basically just open it up, live coding the entire time, and answering questions along the way. But just trying to give some insight into how we're doing things. I might like to show how I'm migrating from a previous version of Spring Authorization Server to the new. Same with Spring Cloud. And I'm also going to go over the example app that we worked on earlier today. So lots of stuff. I'll plan on staying for longer than an hour on Wednesday, and hopefully we'll have office hours there as well. Look forward to that on Wednesday.
Cool. Sounds good. All right. With that, we will see you in the next episode. Thanks everyone for joining us. And as always, friends, happy coding.
Happy coding.